Okay, go. Okay, we ready. Go ahead, Brother Leroy.
Welcome to Books That Matter, the program dedicated to promoting. All right, I'm gonna give the introduction. I'm doing that. Hopefully, you can hear me.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Welcome to Books That Matter, the program dedicated to promoting reading among the viewers. Our brother Leroy, I can hear you. I'm introducing the show. Hear you, Brother DEMETRIC. And let's go back. Books That Matter is dedicated to promoting reading among all. I'm Brother Leroy, thankful to the Most High with the good the day to good deeds, our family, for humanity. That matter is conceived and conceptualized young lady from use that to limit anything of the resident counts in grant houses on 125th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. However, the program does reflect the research done by the participants in the program live in living color, and coming to you live from Tennessee, DEMETRIC MUHAMMAD. He's an author and research specialist, and his book is But Didn't You Kill Malcolm? Brother DEMETRIC, thank you for joining us on Books That Matter.
Brother Leroy, thank you for having us. Are you able to hear me?
I'm able to hear you loud and clear. You're coming through. Everyone within the universe is hearing you right now. Let's get into the reason for this book. Minister Farrakhan has given any number of lectures. It's on YouTube. He's given interviews, and he's answered that question to the max. What is the necessity of you having this book at this particular time? What could you add to the defense of the Nation of Islam, before I put it that way?
That's a wonderful question, Brother Leroy. As you know, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, and as you mentioned, has done a sterling and magnificent job of defending not only himself, but his beloved teacher, the eternal leader of the Nation of Islam, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, as well as the membership of the Nation of Islam, and for that matter, all in Black America. He has been an ardent defender of us all, and I might add, an anointed and a divine defender. One of the things that we have noticed, however, is that from time to time, as it relates to popular culture and the trends that are introduced to influence the masses of the people, frequently we notice that the life, the work, and especially the assassination of Minister Malcolm X is introduced. And attached to Brother Malcolm's assassination is any number of persons speaking from articles written, television programs, documentaries, etc., that seek to advance a false notion that Minister Malcolm X was assassinated on orders from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and the leadership of the Nation of Islam. Beginning in 1994, that mythology and that propaganda campaign aimed at the destruction of the Nation of Islam morphed. And in the revised, morphed version of the propaganda campaign, actually Minister Farrakhan's name was associated with Brother Malcolm's assassination as having been one of the orchestrators or someone who was directly involved in having killed Malcolm. And so any of us as members of the Nation of Islam that have spent any time on the internet in recent years, especially social media, know that we have confronted any number of internet trolls who like to use 140 characters in a tweet or a Facebook post or an Instagram post or a YouTube video to broadcast to their followers and their viewers that it was Farrakhan who killed Malcolm X. And so we wanted to marshal and organize all of the available literature, facts, evidence, interviews, testimonies, and put them together in a volume that could be published for the world to see, both what Minister Farrakhan has said over the years, as well as much more new information that helps us to understand and expose many of the previously hidden hands in the assassination of Minister Malcolm X.
Okay, let's go back over that. And what you are relating that to is how you have structured the book, which reveals how you and the research team, how you have seen the argument or the claim that the Nation of Islam, Honorable Elijah Muhammad, at one time, or the Nation of Islam, assassinated Malcolm. Then it morphs into other arguments, maybe by the decades. And then it morphs into Minister Louis Farrakhan. That's where you're talking about 1994. But before that, when you take it decade by decade,
electoral strategy for him.
Decade by decade,
It should sadden the nation. We know this is a president, and he has said this privately to.
I'm getting
I know. He said, "You ever seen the
getting feedback.
Donald Trump operates in a divided nation."
That coming from your end?
I don't know where that's coming from, brother. I would say this, that we're not blind to the fact that there are a lot of two-legged Grinches and Glitzers that come on the scene whenever they can, because the information that you're sharing, the way you've done this book, is perfect for what you call believers, members of the Nation of Islam, to answer the various myths against the Nation of Islam. You've done that very well. It's not just you writing opinion, you have researched it. But I'm going back. What you have done in the beginning of the book, well, in the table of contents, you have laid out the arguments decade by decade. That's how I've seen it, how it moves from one claim against the Nation of Islam to another, and then to Minister Farrakhan. Let's break those one out for our viewers. Did you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, you did. Okay, you can hear me. What I'm asking you, Brother DEMETRIC, is to flesh out that part, those parts of the book, and I'm definitely going to go and target particular pages.
Yes,
that deal with the crime. Ahead.
Yes, sir. Essentially, and it's interesting that you identify a chronology. We weren't as much going for a chronology in the layout, in as much as we were purposed to address the popular myths that associated with the assassination of Minister Malcolm X. And as you get into it, I talk about in the introduction about how everywhere we go, especially among young audiences, and it doesn't matter the subject matter that we are addressing, at some point in the exchange, a young person will raise their hand and ask that question, hey, but didn't y'all kill Malcolm? And so we have, over the years of traveling and speaking to many different groups, identified the major elements that are component parts of a large myth that is the result of a propaganda campaign that involves the United States government, the FBI, the Anti-Defamation League, the media. And so that is the arrangement that we were going for. But I guess it does also help us to see something of a timeline of the morphing of the myths, and better still, the weaponry of the propaganda, where each myth has been hurled at us out within the popular culture with the intention of demagnetizing, especially young people, from the rebuilt Nation of Islam that has resulted from the work and the labor of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad guiding Minister Farrakhan to rebuild the nation. And so, as you know, Brother Leroy, when the minister began the rebuilding in 1977 and built up a crescendo that in 1985 at Madison Square Garden, tens of thousands of brothers and sisters come out to hear the minister. Moving on into the late 80s and early 90s, Minister Farrakhan is the most sought after speaker anywhere in America and probably the world. And so at that time, it was when Jack Newfield and Rupert Murdoch's New York Post began to introduce a new spin, a new element, a new component part of the propaganda campaign aimed at the Nation of Islam, and that was Farrakhan killed Malcolm X. And that was clearly designed to destroy the minister's popularity and magnetism, especially among the youth, because coinciding with that same period of time, you had the morphing or the corruption, the beginning of the corruption of hip hop. Hip hop began in New York City as what the scholars call message rap. But by the time you get to the early 90s, you have the introduction of gangster rap and the music that had previously been the music of the youth and previously been a music with a message in it, such that when I came into the Nation of Islam, Brother Leroy, I was 15 years old in 1990. And at that time, I could go to a mosque or a study group and hear the message of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Minister Farrakhan. Well, when I left the mosque or the study group, I heard that same message being echoed in my favorite rap artists. And so at that time, hip hop artists were de facto recruiters for Minister Farrakhan and the rebuilding of the Nation of Islam. And so the powers that be determined that they had to stop this relationship because they had a plan for Black youth. And we see it now in its full bloom when people talk about the school to prison pipeline, all of the pathologies that we see today that young people and activists are protesting about. This is what Minister Farrakhan tried to warn our community of many years ago, beginning in 1985 in Madison Square Garden. And then we had a vision experience, and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad told him, brother, the president has planned a war. And the minister would ultimately conclude that that war was a war against Black youth. And so part of the war against Minister Farrakhan and his ability to warn our people was attaching a very dangerous propaganda element to his name and reputation. And that was make Black youth, resurrect Minister Malcolm from the grave, make Black youth to fall in love with him and to identify with him. And then to tell them, you know what? Farrakhan killed him. And really, as the minister has revealed, the ultimate aim was to inspire a young person who loves Minister Malcolm to rise up and to seek to avenge Minister Malcolm's death by trying or attempting to kill Minister Farrakhan. So this is a dangerous myth, and it is a myth that has had some measure of effectiveness. And even to this date, they are preparing for season 2 of the epic series, The Godfather of Harlem. And we also saw that Netflix, even though refusing to air a documentary about the life of Minister Farrakhan and his music, chose instead to air a documentary about the assassination of Malcolm X that, again, through innuendo, tries to blame Brother Malcolm's assassination on the Nation of Islam's leadership. So it's a very important myth, and we are very grateful to Allah and the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan for guiding us to comprise research that we really feel very strongly about, that will be a significant game changer as it makes its way into the public sphere. We believe that the information contained in this volume will really shock a lot of people.
And part of that content relates to COINTELPRO. And they were the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, as quoted in your book, referenced from other sources. They were very happy at the split between and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and very happy at the death of Malcolm. That was the goodness of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And that is where the aftermath of Malcolm leaving, I'm going according to your book, is the myth of the secretaries. What happened in 1993 as it relates to getting that story straight?
Well, yes, as you know, and many researchers have did a lot of good work, and much of it we cite with regard to exposing the hand of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, the counterintelligence program. It is somewhat ubiquitous now in terms of Black research and scholarship. However, what you will find that is new in our work is that we identify the role that the charge of anti-Semitism played in the assassination of Malcolm X. For instance, many of those who try to point the finger at Minister Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, they point to articles that members of the Nation of Islam wrote and published inside the Muhammad Speaks newspaper that were reactions to Malcolm's public condemnation of his teacher and his deliberate scandalizing of his teacher's domestic life. Well, one of the things that we found was that for much ado that has been made about those articles written by Minister Farrakhan, articles written by Jeremiah Shabazz, articles even written by Malcolm's blood brothers. I mean, these were ministers in the nation who were doing what Malcolm used to do so well, and that was defend their leader and teacher, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But these articles pale in comparison to what we were able to excavate coming from the very powerful Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith and what was syndicated through Jewish periodicals throughout America. This is a whole new body of research that sheds new light on the relationship between the ADL and the FBI, especially where COINTELPRO is concerned. They have heretofore not really been identified as culprits in the sabotage of groups. Certainly everyone knows that they have dogged the trail of the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan in the rebuilding, but that is not the beginning of their nefarious activities where strong Black groups are concerned. And I think the reader would be very surprised at some of the things that they admit to and that they were party to with respect to the assassination of Malcolm X. What you're referencing in 1993 was when the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan at Savior's Day shared the platform with wives of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad so that these sisters who had been slandered and talked about in such an evil and malicious way in the media could actually, number one, speak for themselves and could offer their weighty testimony in defense of their husband, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And inside the book, we include transcripts of their words in defense of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. These beautiful sisters, brilliant sisters, are really vindication, them and their children, for how Allah guided the Honorable Elijah Muhammad into the taking of wives that would produce children who would be guides and helpers to him in his mission in future times. So that is just one of the powerful myth busters that we have had it, that really takes the slander, and I hate to even repeat the slander, because, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says that if you repeat slander, more than 3 times, you become a party to it. But we all know that Brother Malcolm and the media chose to take the domestic life of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and to make it tabloid fodder, the stuff of scandal. And so I believe that we have really destroyed that myth for the reader in the pages that are devoted to that, because that has been one of the main elements. And we talk about how it has been so vicious, Brother Leroy, that even just recently, when the young sister who did the documentary about R. Kelly and his abuse of young women, she tweeted out a tweet claiming that Malcolm X died protecting innocent Black girls from a predator. And of course, she was making an oblique reference, not so oblique reference to those who are familiar with the history, but an oblique reference to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And of course, Minister Farrakhan's Twitter army responded very powerfully to her, and she took the tweet down. But it just goes to show how that slander has legs, even in the modern time, seeking to slander and to scandalize a divine and holy messenger of Allah God, the most honorable Elijah Muhammad.
Brother DEMETRIC, when we look at that young lady and her tweet, when I look at it, you say, all right, where did she get that from? She didn't get it from reading a whole bunch of books. She's involved in a whole, I'm not teaching you, I'm telling you how I reacted, that was fed to her, just as it is being fed to some young guys who are on YouTube, and they are so knowledgeable, and I say knowledgeable in quotes, that I'm saying, wait, I lived during Malcolm's time. I donated to the OAAU before coming into the knowledge of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam. So I was in the nationalist circle, so I know how it felt for Malcolm to be lost. And at the same time, for me, it's impossible for the young people who are stepping forward to have the same feeling. They may deny it, but they just can't have that feeling because they don't know. So somewhere they're being fed on trips, on somewhere. It happens now. People who say, hey man, I read books and I can come to my own conclusions. They speak with so much energy until someone counters it. Now, going into the book, in terms of the myths, in terms of, the attack on Minister Farrakhan, how you point out that in the 80s, how the rap was positive, and it also, you could hear quite often Minister Farrakhan's name mentioned in it, and the determination of those who mention in the rap. I'm talking about the positive rap. They would refer to Farrakhan, they put some rhyme in there. And the music industry not only targeted the positiveness of the music, but also the fact that Minister Farrakhan had a following among them, and also the fact that a lot of the brothers who were in the business were independent producers. They're making deals on their own. So the gangster rap is something that has to be explored, not by you, but Bob Law here in New York has done that. And he has documentation on how they gathered together, that is the enemy, and with the intent of taking back that element of the music industry. Now, let's go to Farrakhan killed Malcolm myth. And that is the enemy, Minister Lewis, talk about the influence of Minister Louis Farrakhan. You have it in the book. You relate the influence of Minister Louis X at the time of Malcolm's assassination, and how it was, for me, it was impossible for him to engineer the death or have a hand in the death of Malcolm. Just deal with that for a minute.
Yeah, sure. It's a great point, and it's a point that I have discussed with the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan directly, and that is, you know, this notion that young Minister Louis X, who was the minister of Temple number 11 in Boston at that time, would have had the ability, or would have had the influence, or would have had the power to give a command to the membership of the Nation of Islam. At that time, that assertion would have been, you know, not a good assertion to make. Minister Farrakhan, back then, Minister Louis X, he was not even Minister Farrakhan at that time. And so you're talking about a man today who at that time had not yet become the man that he is today. He was a young, zealous, excited, and beautiful brother who was learning the ministry at one time from Brother Malcolm, but subsequently directly from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And so just from a point of fact perspective, he was not, as they would say in the streets, a shot caller of the rank and file inside the nation. Minister Farrakhan, and we point this out in the book, you have to understand the context of the reaction of Minister Farrakhan, as well as the membership of the nation. We are people who are part of a spiritual and a religious community. And I don't care, Brother Leroy, if the Torah is your sacred text, the gospel is your sacred text, or the Quran is your sacred text. All of these scriptures contain commands and instructions that the believers are to defend the faith. And so they have attempted to say that, well, Farrakhan was jealous of Malcolm, and so he hatched the plot to assassinate Malcolm. And this is, you know, so false.
Grant houses community radio, the soul
That's
of Upper West Side.
a station ID. That's a station ID, Dimitri. Just hold on a moment. It's automatic. And once again, it identifies what we're doing here. Grant Houses Community Radio being an independent internet radio station in Harlem, USA. It's one of two in 2 different housing developments. I'm sorry, go ahead, Brother Dimitri.
No, what we were saying was that it's just ludicrous to assume that the minister could call any shots. And it is also ludicrous that the minister was jealous or envious of the position that Brother Malcolm held. Those who took to writing articles, the minister had 4 articles published in the Muhammad Speaks, but Malcolm's blood brother also did. You also had other ministers who did. And so they were not writing out of or envy, but they were writing because it is the duty of the believer to defend the faith. And unless you make room, you know, again, you know, I heard a great brother say once, it doesn't matter that you believe what I believe, but it matters that you understand that I believe it. So people make room for the fact that we believe that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is the messenger of God. You can't understand our reaction when you speak ill of him, when you insult him, or when you come against him. You won't understand it. But it's clearly laid out, and we try to help the reader to understand from the perspective of scripture why we reacted in the nation, the way we reacted when Brother Malcolm, under the influence of the FBI and its informants and agent provocateurs who were going back and forth between Malcolm and the nation, seeking to stir up the controversy. Malcolm, under the influence of misinformation, he lashes out in an emotional way against his teacher, a man that he had loved and a man that loved him like a son. But under the influence of informants, agent provocateurs who had set upon Malcolm, who had targeted Malcolm. Why? Not because Brother Malcolm is, as they say today, was just independently great and brilliant. Certainly he was that, but his independent brilliance and greatness is not what put him on the radar of the United States government, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, and the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. What put him on that radar was that he was the chief helper, the chief spokesman for the one man who had been there in their crosshairs since the 30s, the one movement that they hated more than any other movement. See, most of the time, Brother Leroy, when they talk about COINTELPRO, they talk about what COINTELPRO did to groups like the Panthers. But scholars know that the lion's share of J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO resources were devoted at the destruction of the one man and the one leader that he feared more than any other group that would change America, and that was Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. So Malcolm became a target in a similar way, you could say, as how when President Trump, who has an anger against the present government in Iran. So what does he do? He targets Iran's best general, General Soleimani. And he assassinated General Soleimani, but his real target is the regime in power in Iran. General Soleimani then, in this context, is collateral damage, a part of a larger war. Malcolm's assassination at the hands of the FBI and the ADL was collateral damage, a part of a larger war that had begun before Malcolm ever joined the nation. And that was the war against the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam that, mind you, continued after Brother Malcolm's assassination. Because you have some who argue that, well, of course the FBI was involved, but they collaborated with the nation. Nothing could be further from the truth. If such was the truth, then we could have expected that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI would have stopped their infiltrating activities against the nation after Malcolm was assassinated. But instead, continued to work to destroy the nation on up and through 1975 at the departure of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and really beyond. So the minister and those who rose to defend the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, number one, did it because they loved the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Two, did it out of a sense of duty that the scriptures command. We must defend the faith.
And we're talking about those individuals who wrote basically what Islam has done for me, what the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad have done for them in the Muhammad Speaks at that time when Malcolm left.
Yes, and they weren't exclusively a part of that series, but these were ministers, Minister Samuel of Gary, Indiana, the minister in Mansfield, Ohio, I forget his name, the minister of Baltimore, Minister Jeremiah Shabazz, Malcolm's brother, Filbert, which to go back to your earlier question about how Minister Lewis X didn't have any kind of wherewithal at that time to give any orders. Compare Malcolm's blood brother, Minister Filbert, who was over and the minister in charge of 4 cities in the state of Michigan. Minister Farrakhan was only the minister over 1 city, Boston, Massachusetts. Minister Filbert had been in the nation longer than Minister Lewis. However, you never hear that it was Malcolm's own blood brother that called for his death. You only hear it was Minister Lewis. And that's because, quite frankly, you know, Minister Farrakhan is who he is today. Because he sits in the seat of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, he now is the target. He's the target like Malcolm was the target when Malcolm was the best helper, but he's also the target like the Honorable Elijah Muhammad has been the target because he's sitting in his seat. So they have to say that, well, you know, Minister Farrakhan was party to a look at what he wrote. That what Minister Farrakhan wrote in the book to show the reader how what Minister Farrakhan wrote in terms of saying that Malcolm's actions were worthy of death, but that he wouldn't meet that fate because the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had confidence that Allah would grant him victory over his enemies. We dissect that quote and we contrast that quote against the quotes of other members of the nation like world heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali, who had very harsh statements about Brother Malcolm at that time, but is a name that you never ever heard come up in the conversation about the assassination of Malcolm X. And this is because our brother became a cash cow for the world of boxing and sports. And so even though his statements against Malcolm at that time were very harsh and condemnatory, according to some, but again, he too was a part of a body of believers who were reacting, not out of envy or jealousy, but were reacting to what they viewed and what in reality was attacks against the man that had raised them from mental and spiritual death and had given to them a marvelous new life. And that man was and is the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad.
There is you referenced the fact that researchers, scholars have found that the target of J. Edgar Hoover was more the Nation of Islam, number 1, and communists second. That's in you referenced that in the book, Race Matters. Is that the book?
Yes, by Ken O'Reilly, yes.
So the information is there. It's not something where you're just guessing and putting into a book. That's why this book is very, very valuable. In New York, it's available from Brother Joe. Brother Joe is on 127th Street and Malcolm X Boulevard. In fact, he has all the books that you want to get from the Nation of Islam. And this book is, But Didn't You Kill Malcolm? Now, I want to go back to your initial statement about, you hinted at it, but we haven't dealt with it, that the youth are the target for the misinformation, for the myths today, the youth, Black youth. What's so valuable about Black youth that they would even be concerned about diverting their attention against the nation? What, it's like, so what?
So the question is, what's so valuable about Black youth?
About Black youth that it would make those in authority, the J. Edgar Hoovers of today, the so-called police departments of the day, and I say so-called advisedly because when you take the uniform off, you got the same individual who is using the uniform to do their dirty work. In those instances, we're not against the police, but I'm dealing with the value of Black youth because the introduction of your book deals with your concern for reaching them.
Yes. Well, I don't know if I have it in the book, but there's a quote from J. Edgar Hoover that I have in my research notes. And he says that he who controls the youth controls the future of America. Now, this is significant because one of the denial objectives in the COINTELPRO papers or memos was to prohibit Black nationalist groups. He called them hate type organizations, Black nationalist hate type organizations, from attracting youthful adherents. And so Hoover was a man who was very wise, even though he is often mocked and ridiculed for certain predilections and idiosyncrasies that he had. Make no mistake about it, he was a wise man. And he understood something about the future destiny of Black people in America, such that a part of his language that he used, you know, this man is the top law enforcement officer, top law enforcement officer under the Attorney General, who is the top law enforcement officer in the country. But in his memos, you find it sporadically placed religious language. Messiah, a Black Messiah, or a Messiah raised among Black people. Well, that's intriguing, because why is a law enforcement official using religious language? And we kind of explore some of the reasons for that in the book, and how that is a signal of their relationship with the very powerful Jewish organization, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, and Milton Ellerin, who was a go-between between ADL and FBI. But suffice it to say, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad has said that our people have a glorious destiny, Brother Leroy. If we have a glorious destiny as a people, well, those who oppress us, they don't want to see us arrive at that glorious destiny. So they have to work to destroy the youth among our people, because it is the youth of every people who carry the ideas and the potential of that people into the future. And so Black youth are a target. You know, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing introduced to the world a concept called the fear of white genetic annihilation. And in her writings, she said that those in power in America have looked at the population growth of the Caucasian or European race of people all over the world. And they are alarmed that they seem to have a great problem keeping their population at a certain level, because their birth rate in many European countries is below zero. Well, what is the birth rate of people of color? The Black man, the brown man, the red man, the yellow man. Well, the birth rate has been so strong that oftentimes we have so-called unwanted pregnancies. I imagine that, of people whose pregnancies, they have so many children, they don't even want to have any more, but they're oppressed by people who want to have pregnancies and children. So we see that a plan has been hatched. And for students of scripture, it's the same plan that Pharaoh had in the Old Testament, the same plan Herod had in the New Testament. Kill them before they grow. Pharaoh said, kill the boy babies. Herod said, kill the boy babies. They were trying to destroy the same thing Hoover was trying to destroy, a Messiah. So in America, when we say these kinds of things in the Nation of Islam, people charge us with going too far. People charge us with a selective reading of the scripture. However, if the scriptures of God have any real value in the modern time, I argue it is in the ability of those of us who live in the modern time to be able to draw relevant parallels to the events and happenings and ongoings of our modern time, to what was foretold on the pages of those scriptures. Too many people in religion just use the scripture as history books. They say, well, this happened back then. This happened thousands of years ago, without saying, wow, why did God give us a story about something that happened thousands of years ago if we were not to expect it to happen in our lifetime? So the story of the proverbial or the prophetic children of Israel, Minister Farrakhan and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teach, is the true story and saga of the Black people of America. So just as their youth, their babies were the target for the destruction of their entire people, our youth and our babies are the target for the destruction of our people.
The straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, as to that defining moment when you said, I got to do this book. What was that?
You know, Brother Leroy, I didn't want to do this book. I fought it for a long time, and it just kept coming up, you know, and I began to see, because I work with young people, and I began to see how, on one hand, if they heard Minister Farrakhan, they were like, wow, who is that? He's bad. But in the next instance, the afterthought was, when they learned who he was, oh, didn't he kill Malcolm? So as I began to see how the very target audience that you could argue needs the life-giving teachings of the most honorable Elijah Muhammad more so than anybody else, won't come and embrace it because they believe that it was the nation that killed a man that they have been taught to love. Again, you pointed that out beautifully. They don't love him because they lived during his lifetime. They don't love him because they were a part of the movement during those days. They love him because they were taught to love him. And it is not that Malcolm is not worthy of love. You know, I talk about in the book, I have a section called Malcolm Deserves a Lot of Credit for the work that he did. And if you will remember last year's Savior's Day, the minister said before the world how much Malcolm meant to him. And so I want to make it clear that those of us in the Nation of Islam, whether we were alive during that time, like yourself, or we were not a part of the movement like myself and others, we all love Brother Malcolm. Our disagreement is with how he ended his life. Our disagreement is really a part of the small period of time that he was outside of the nation. Just pause for a moment, Brother Leroy, to reflect that Brother Malcolm, I think he became the minister in New York in 1954. And so March of 1964, he gives a press statement, his so-called Declaration of Independence, where he breaks away from the nation. He's assassinated February of 1965. So he wasn't even out of the nation officially a full year. Yet it's that Malcolm, the 11-month Malcolm from March of 64 to February of 65, that the general public has seized upon, because that's the man that broke from Elijah. That's the man that went to Mecca and saw whites and began to embrace them. That's the man that condemned Elijah Muhammad, etc. Yet Malcolm X is the Malcolm from 1952 through 1964. And so we know and love him. At that time, there was not a better helper for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And I argue, and you see it in my book, that evidence supports the idea that Malcolm was on his way back into the nation. After taking a great fall, he was on his way back. And we document from the statements of his secretary, administrative assistant, Miss Sarah Mitchell, that one of the things that he had planned to say the day he was killed was that he was retracting the accusations he had made against the Nation of Islam for trying to kill him and his family. He was also going to introduce a plan to take over Harlem. And we put that in the book, which is very significant because Harlem, many people may be shocked to know, at one time, Harlem had per capita one of the largest Jewish populations anywhere in the world. And many Jewish merchants sold goods to Black people. Malcolm famously criticized the Jewish merchants for becoming wealthy at the expense of their Black customers, and then taking that money that they made from their Black customers to build their own independent communities. And so we show how Malcolm's criticism of the exploitive practices of Jewish merchants fed into him being labeled as a great and the leading Black anti-Semite. So much so that Malcolm's preaching was blamed for violence against Jewish merchants in Harlem and Rochester in the summer of 1964. So we just want to be clear that we were motivated out of our love for truth, our love for the Nation of Islam, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, the Honorable Elijah, our love for our people, and our love for Brother Malcolm. Because I include words in this book given to me directly from Minister Farrakhan to defend Malcolm X, particularly as recent writers, including Manning Marable, but before him, Bruce Perry, and others who have tried to scandalize his name and to say that he was a closeted homosexual.
Right.
Now just think about that, Brother Leroy. I.C. Davis eulogizing Brother Malcolm as the emblem and the embodiment of our Black manhood.
Right.
And for 50 years later, the media to say, well, he was gay. So we defend Brother Malcolm against the unfair critiques of our collective enemy, while at the same time identifying that we cannot escape deeming some of his actions as that of a hypocrite. However, I make this statement. You have to place an asterisk by his hypocrisy. What do I mean by that? Well, normally if you see something on a list or in a book that has an asterisk by it, it means that it requires further explanation, that it may be the case. Malcolm's hypocrisy is what I call manufactured hypocrisy, as opposed to organic hypocrisy, because he was targeted by the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world, so powerful that they effect regime changes in foreign governments. And here they were using the might of their espionage prowess on a little group of Black people who were just trying to get the white man's foot off of our neck so that we might enjoy freedom, justice, and equality.
Grant, houses, community, radio, the
another
soul
station ID. We're going to
of
cover
Upper West Side.
We're going to cover a few things very quickly as we approach our conclusion to this interview. But Didn't You Kill Malcolm? A very important book. Why is it important, ladies and gentlemen? I lived in the time of Malcolm, and I know what it is to have been in a organization, a nationalist organization, that when Malcolm was assassinated, we knew that the Nation of Islam was finished, couldn't come back, but it did, and it did, and it did. And that speaks to something very, very significant, as Brother DEMETRIC indicated. This is a spiritual, it's a spiritual situation. But if you don't believe in a spiritual being, a supreme being, then you miss the whole point. Brother DEMETRIC, what has been a surprise feed reaction? You get reaction to your book. What corner may have given you a surprise reaction? Like, wow, can you respond to that?
Well,
see if
Brother Leroy, I would say that the book is still in its infancy, and it is making its way slowly into the mainstream. It was released for Savior's Day this year, 2020. And I guess the first surprise was a pleasant surprise, and that was it was approved of and really loved by the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, who is my teacher. And so I was very happy that in a climate where he had asked the nation's membership to really cease making public statements about Brother Malcolm, because many of the public statements that brothers and sisters were making were not reflective of the minister's sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
Minister Farrakhan loves Malcolm X. And like I said, with respect to understanding the religious context, if you don't understand the religious context, you will draw the wrong conclusions about the motivations of all of the actors involved in this drama. Likewise, if you don't understand that Minister Farrakhan loves Malcolm X, you will also draw the wrong conclusions. And so, and I just want to say this before I talk more about the reactions. The Nation of Islam was a family, is a family. And sometimes in families, there are dynamics. In the family, when love is present, sometimes if one of the members of the family does something that breaks the bond of love, love can in that instant turn to hate. However, and I'm not talking about something we all have not experienced.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
In Islam, Brother Leroy, you know that when a husband and a wife are having marital problems, no one is allowed to interfere.
Mm.
Why? A man could say, oh, that's a beautiful woman. She's in a bad relationship with her husband. Let me slide in. Or a man could say, that's a beautiful woman. She's having difficulty with her, or that's a beautiful, or the male could see the wife and desire her and try to slide in, or the man could see, or the you know what I'm trying to
female could see the husband. The female could see the husband.
In the middle of the wife. But in Islam, that's forbidden. And the point I'm trying to make is this. The reason is because many times, time can bring two people who once loved each other back into reconciliation. So Allah does not allow interference into marriage. Because time and distance has often the effect of effecting or effectuating a reconciliation. So the period where the minister and the believers had a real strong hatred for what Malcolm was doing to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad could have went the way of many family disagreements, and the reconciliation could have been effectuated, was it not for the FBI and all of those who were working with them, and I add the ADL, working to ensure that this family split would never result in reconciliation. But that does not mean that there's not love in the minister's heart and in the heart of many who lived during that period of time for the fond days, the fond memories, the love that was shared, the brotherhood, the sisterhood that was shared, the long conversations over bean soup and bean pie and black coffee, and sisters babysitting each other's children while their husbands go out and soldier in the field. Man, we are love each other. And so that don't mean we don't have disagreements sometimes, but it should not be the government of America to seize upon our disagreements to make us fight and do harm to one another. See? So I want people to understand, when I talk to Minister Farrakhan about Minister Malcolm, you know, he loves Brother Malcolm and is disappointed that Brother Malcolm's life ended the way it ended. So his approval,
DEMETRIC,
prize.
I'm sorry, go ahead. His approval of the book.
Approval was a pleasant surprise. And we have been pleasantly surprised that everyone who has read it up to this point have shared with us nothing but positive feedback. And we hope to be able to discuss it like we're discussing it with you on programs that reach the membership of the general public. We hope to be able to get feedback from prominent individuals, because again, I'm very confident, not so much in my words, but I am so confident at the facts and the arguments that are made, that if you are a critical thinker or if you're a fair-minded person, your eyes will be opened to know that there's a false narrative that has been perpetuated. And that false narrative is that the Nation of Islam and nowadays Minister Farrakhan, I said, your eyes will come open that that's a false.
As we conclude, I'll share with you and the audience my defining moment with this book in my own personal measurement of how well it could be before I even got into the book. Two things. One, I saw this guy on YouTube, a young guy, just ragging the Nation of Islam, exposing the Nation of Islam as having assassinated Malcolm. I'm looking at this guy saying, wait a minute, let me get into this book. And I know what the guy is saying, because the guy is talking something that lives in my time, not his time. So I get into the book, and there are two areas that I say, if it's in this book, this brother has done some good research. And it's towards the end where you bring up the name of Ray Wood. Ray Wood, I wasn't familiar with his name, but I was familiar with this. On the night that Malcolm was assassinated, the night that he was assassinated, I went downtown from Harlem and picked up the New York Times, because I knew they would have, big coverage of the assassination. So I read this, I read every line in this paper, and they mention one thing. They mention the guy who they caught right in front of the Audubon, had the broken leg, he couldn't get any farther, it was beating him up. But the article also mentioned that there was another one apprehended a couple of blocks away. No name. In the morning, I pick up the New York Times. I know it's going to be some elaboration, but that description of one man, of the additional man being caught, was completely out of the paper. I read the things, I said, wait a minute, I must have missed something. So when they arrested two, I wasn't in the nation at the time, when they arrested two Black men at their home and not mention this other man that had been arrested the same day as the individual caught in front of the Audubon, I knew something was up just from that. And when you included that, you give them a name. Actually, you don't give them a name. You point to the publication, The Realist. The Realist, their inaugural issue was on the assassination of Malcolm. And that particular publication was almost like a pamphlet size, not 8.5 by 11, but half that. And that's where it was mentioned that the second guy had been apprehended. So for the audience, when you look at the assassination of Malcolm, for the audience, when you look at the assassination of Malcolm, how come no mention was made of the second man arrested the same day, within minutes away from the Audubon? That raises a flag. So the guy's name is Ray Wood. That's laid out in your book. You also have a good section on the people who were around Malcolm and what they were saying in terms of, no, they knew the nation didn't assassinate Malcolm, including the young lady who was the secretary. And her testimony was new to me in terms of what Malcolm was saying just before he was assassinated. That is the day before, that morning, whatever. The question that I have, I may have missed it, is how was the movie X by Spike Lee looked upon in terms of furthering misinformation about the nation?
Well, first of all, Warner Brothers, according to Spike Lee, gave him $18 million. I think it cost him over 32 million, so they didn't give him enough. But again, as you say, a red flag. Why is Warner Brothers willing to fund a movie about a man who called the white man the devil and who is also widely condemned as the leading Black anti-Semite? Warner Brothers is a Jewish-owned company. The Warner Brothers were Jewish men. Hollywood is basically created according to historian Neil Gabler, who wrote the book, An Empire of Our Own, talking about Eastern European Jewish immigrants who created the motion picture industry. So Warner Brothers at this point is a behemoth. It's a massive production company. They had originally wanted to do a documentary, and from what I can tell, they did a documentary, but it was never released in the early 70s about Brother Malcolm. But it was condemned by James Baldwin and others. And of course, James Baldwin wrote a script that he wanted to have made into a movie that, from what I understand, his script was in some ways consulted by Spike Lee in putting his movie together. But Spike ultimately said he was going to present his own version of Brother Malcolm. But he admitted in an interview with Professor Henry Louis Gates that he knew that Warner Brothers wanted to emphasize the post-Mecca Malcolm, the man who had stopped calling white people the blue-eyed devil. So all of this is important context because, as the old saying goes, whenever you receive information, you have to consider the source. So could we expect a faithful, accurate, powerful presentation of the life of Malcolm X from Warner Brothers? I think Spike Lee did a great job in terms of the cinematic qualities, the great acting by Denzel. He was able to get financial help from, I think, prominent Blacks like Michael Jordan, Bill Cosby. I think Oprah helped him. However, many who watch it would come away with pointing the finger at the Nation of Islam for his assassination. And so we talk about Warner Brothers in the book because they had a history of volunteering. They were a motion picture company that COINTELPRO, you have to understand, COINTELPRO in the memos, they boast about their friends in the media. In other words, they had control of certain journalists, certain news publications, that if they wanted to put a taint on an individual or a group, they could have a New York Times writer to publish it under his name, basically the Bureau's ideas about said person or group. So Warner Brothers signed up to be some of their friends in media. And specifically, they were interested in helping J. Edgar Hoover identify communists, radicals, and anti-Semites. And so here, lo and behold, is this company that's in charge of giving us a movie about Malcolm. And so Malcolm in the movie appears strong, he appears heroic, his teacher appears to be weak and corrupt.
Right.
And so ultimately you have the lionizing of Malcolm. And this is, again, you know, when you talk about critical thinking, Malcolm is always lionized, and the man that made Malcolm is always mocked and ridiculed. Well, how could that man not also be a great lion and warrior? Because he took Malcolm from being a common criminal and thief and made Malcolm into the famous, legendary Malcolm X. And as the scriptures teach us, you tell a tree by the fruit that it bears. You tell him by his works. If, as the mainstream media wants us to believe, that Elijah Muhammad ain't nothing, that Elijah Muhammad is weak, that Elijah Muhammad is immoral, all of these things that the mainstream media wants us to believe about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. If that's true, how did he produce Malcolm X? How did he produce Minister Louis Farrakhan? Why did Reader's Digest write that he was the most powerful Black man in America? Why did he receive so much attention by J. Edgar Hoover, by the FBI, and even other law enforcement agencies as a target for destruction? And so this kind of goes back to your earlier question, Brother Leroy, about Black youth. See, one of the problems in Black youth loving Malcolm and hating the man and the community that made Malcolm is that they will always be in a position of admiring a man that they aren't motivated to become like. Because if you love Malcolm and love what produced Malcolm, you can never become like the Malcolm that you love, because the Malcolm that you love became that way because he submitted himself to the guidance of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He was so much in submission to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad that Malcolm had made a decision one time, Brother Leroy, there was a particular journalist who mocked Malcolm for always prefacing his statements by saying the Honorable Elijah Muhammad
teaches.
And this particular journalist, his name escapes me, Malcolm told him that if you keep that up, you'll never be allowed to come and cover any of my speeches. He's that serious in his love and devotion. I even have in my files a note from Malcolm that I believe was a part of his message that is called the Ballad or the Bullet. And in his notes, he has credit to Elijah Muhammad for teaching me everything that I knew. This is in his lecture notes in handwriting. So, but if the youth love Malcolm and hate Elijah, they'll never go and drink from the well that Malcolm drank from. So they will reduce Malcolm to fan worship instead of what he should be, an example for how to live their life. And this is the purpose of the propaganda. See, Malcolm is resurrected posthumously, meaning from beyond the grave, and given to the youth of today as someone that they should relate to, love, identify with, and admire. Nothing wrong with that. But the purpose of legends, the purpose of the ancestors, the purpose of the great ones is that the youth read and study their history and follow in their footsteps to become their lifetime and to move progress for our people forward toward victory. Our youth prepared to do that by loving the proverbial orange or the proverbial apple, by hating the apple tree. No way for a man to like apples, Brother Leroy, and then turn around and hate apple trees. If you like apples, you gotta like apple trees, because apples come from apple trees. Malcolm X's come from Elijah Muhammad's. If you want to be like a Malcolm X, you gotta go and submit to an Elijah Muhammad. And today, the Honorable Louis Farrakhan is his national and international representative. And he is still making men like the Honorable Elijah Muhammad made men like Malcolm X. And that class is still open, because I say this and I close. The editor of the New Amsterdam News, and I have this in the book, he said, Malcolm and the Muslims, I admire their ability to transform the people. He said, I should hope that that ability didn't die with Malcolm X. And I can bear witness that that ability to transform the lives of our people from the waywardness and the destroyedness of what white America has done to us, that power still exists in the Nation of Islam to transform our lives.
Brother DEMETRIC, thank you for your presence here on Books That Matter. But Didn't You Kill Malcolm is a document for those who are in the Nation of Islam and those who seriously want to know the answers to the various myths. It's a well-documented book. You read the book, you're going to be reading additional sources, and that's the way it's supposed to be. Anything you read, you should go to the sources. Thank you, Brother DEMETRIC, and we want to thank our audience for viewing Books That Matter, People Who Matter, and focus on reading a book, getting a book. Once again, Brother Joe in Harlem, 127th Street and Malcolm X Boulevard. He's one of the sources for But Didn't You Kill Malcolm? Get this book, you'll enjoy it. And then if you see me on the street, we'll set up a study group and discuss the various points in the book. Thank you once again, Brother DEMETRIC. God bless you and your family.
Brother Leroy, I'd also like to note that there are those that can purchase the book online from our website, researchminister.com.
Repeat that, brother.
Minister.com.
Researchminister.com.
Yes,
Researchminister.com to get this book from the internet and by way of the internet, those of you who are not in Harlem, USA. Once again, thank you very much. God bless you and your family, brother.
Thank you, brother. Likewise.
And once again, we thank the Resident Association of the Grant Houses for allowing us the opportunity to have an independent station. God bless you all. And the production team here, we want to thank the producer, Ms. Nettles, for having come up with the concept of Books That Matter, People Who Matter, to promote reading among all segments of the viewing audience. God bless you all with a wonderful and a fantastic day.